Just picture, if you're a mum, going, no, that's not going to happen. Last week we spoke about the 4 kilometre an hour God, or if you're a fan of the imperial system, the 3 mile an hour God. I had to convert it into kilometres to understand it myself. Now, 4 kilometres, as we've spoken about here and there with different people I've spoken to over the week, 4 kilometres is not an exact rounding of 3 miles, but just for the sake of brevity, to kind of get the point across, we're going to go with 4 kilometres. 4 kilometres. Now, when we say the 4 kilometre an hour God, we're of course referring to Jesus Christ, and we're speaking of the Trinity, how God exists in 3 persons and also one, and Jesus is God, and it's very confusing, and that will be Trinity Sunday's sermon, so stay tuned for that. You don't have to get your head around the Trinity. More on that, as I said, on Trinity Sunday. But it's a shorthand way of saying that Jesus Christ is God with us on earth. So that's what we need to know. Now, the 4 kilometre an hour God is challenging us across Lent to do this thing called redeeming rest, to start to think about what it might be like to be a bit slower, a bit more intentional, particularly around this idea of the Sabbath, the idea that Sunday for Christians is the Sabbath day and what that might look like. Now, I'll tell you something I used to struggle myself a bit with slowness, with slowing down. Now, I've always been a bit impatient. My father used to tell me that all the time. He said, "You're so impatient." I said, "I just need to know now. I have to do this thing now." And I'm not sure if it was impatience or it was just anxiety, really. I'm not sure if those two things are exactly the same thing. But I've always been someone who, if there's uncertainty, I need to be certain. And Christianity is like not that kind of religion. It's actually a very uncertain in many ways kind of faith. But in my former career, now those of you who have been teachers or around teachers, we like to get things done quickly and we like to be efficient. And there's a reason for that. Because there's a couple of teachers in our congregation, or former teachers. You're always a teacher, whether or not you're working in a school or not. You're always one. You've got to get through the curriculum. Because if you don't, the boss, the principal, will say, "You taught, 5 weeks worth of this program. Where's the rest of it?" And by the time, if you're in my shoes as a high school teacher, the kids will get around to their HSC and they haven't even touched one of the topics because you're going too slow on one of the others. So you had this very finite amount of time to get through material, and I think that's a real teacher thing. You've got to get through this in 10 weeks. Tough. So slowing down was a real challenge for me, and still is. I'm going to give you an example. When I first started in ministry, I completed the first of 3 courses of clinical pastoral education. I mentioned CPE last week, but clinical pastoral education requires a placement at a hospital. And in my case, it was the John Hunter. If you've ever been to the John Hunter, it's a very busy place. Things are always happening. There's lots of noise and there's beeping and shuffling and all sorts of things going on. It's not a slow place. And with CPE, you get assigned a ward. So they'll say, "Righto, Kim, you're going to go to," in my case, was K1, which is the dialysis ward, and I also had F1, which is the orthopedics ward. So broken bones and broken kidneys actually were my specialty. But what happens is you don't get a list of who you're going to visit for pastoral care. So they don't give you a list that says, "Here's all the Anglicans." If you're the Anglican chaplain, you get that. But if you're a CPE student, you go, "There's your ward, have fun." Which is incredibly terrifying, can I tell you? Because you're walking into a space and essentially cold calling people for pastoral care. So you can walk into a 4-bed room and there'll be 4 people in there, and you just sort of stand there, make eye contact and see if anybody's interested. And most people aren't. Most people aren't. And part of the role is you actually need to have a conversation with someone to then bring that conversation, disguised, you make up names and change things, to a group who then talk about your interaction. So it improves your pastoral care. It's really, really good, but it's very terrifying. But anyway, so nobody was expecting me in K1. Nobody knew that Reverend Kim would be here. I wasn't even called Reverend Kim, just Kim. No one knew that Kim would be in K1 that day. And yet, I would get down to K1. K1's right on the bottom of John Hunter, right in the corner, on the bottom floor. And I would get there and I'd go, gee, I'm puffed. Because I was walking so fast, so quickly to try and get down there. And I'm like, when I got there, I'm like, well, now what do I do? No one's expecting me. I have no reason to be in a hurry. Why was I in such a hurry? I used to get there and go, what am I doing here that needed this urgency, this level of pushing myself to get there? And I started to think about why I was doing it. Because I'd be puffed and I'd be a little bit scrambled. I wasn't able to be present for the person who may have needed pastoral care because I was worn out from the walk. There was something in my mind or in my spirit that said, get there quickly. You've got to get there quickly. And I sat down and I reflected on it and I thought, okay, that's weird because nothing in the outside world is saying this. Father Roger, who's the chaplain there, was definitely not saying that. Something else was saying it. And I thought, where do I get this expectation from? And I thought, probably when I was at school as a student, not so much as a teacher, but as a student and as a little kid, from my parents, grandparents, teachers, authority figures really, that in some way had instilled a message in me that said, if you're idle or if you're sitting, you're not being productive, you're not contributing to society, or you're being lazy. And laziness is a quality nobody wants to be associated with. That's the last thing you want someone to call you. It was really rough. And I went, oh, people are thinking I'm lazy if I'm not looking like I've got to go somewhere. Now the chaplain is called to be very different in a place like that. They're actually meant to be really slow and really deliberate and listen and ask questions and listen in a way that others don't. It was a real works-based theology. Works-based theology. It says that if I'm not doing something for God, if I'm not being productive for God, then I feel like I'm not doing this faith thing right. I think that's what happens for me as well. And we see it, Paul in Romans tells us about Abraham. And it's actually Abraham, we've got that reading at the beginning where Abraham is told to just go. You're going that way. And he goes, oh, all right, fair enough. And Paul tells us that Abraham said, okay, off I go. And that was a slow journey in the desert. You know, Abraham, as Paul tells us, Abraham couldn't have done anything for his own salvation. God gives it to him as a grace-filled gift. Let me give you another quick example. It's only been in the last 5 years where I could take a holiday and sit on a beach or sit in a forest and just stare, just be in it and do basically nothing. Now I like books, so I usually take books with me on holidays. But before that, I was like, no, if I'm getting on a plane, I've got to have an adventure. You know, I've got to go and do something in this city or wherever I was. I can sit here in Newcastle on the beach. Why am I going to Vanuatu to do that? But this holiday where I was just on holidays recently, the best part of the holiday for me was sitting in a comfortable chair, watching the trade winds blow in a storm onto the island. I did that for like 2 hours. And I tell you, I've never been able to do that in my life. And I thought, oh, something about this slowness is getting into my psyche now. So that was a real help for me. But know that it's been a struggle and a long time. As I said, it's not always been like this for me. But when I started to say to myself, hang on, I don't have to listen to that expectation that I have to be busy to be valuable. That's just someone's opinion. That's not who I am in Christ. And it's a bit like Nicodemus today in the gospel. It's a fond gospel for me, I was saying to the servers, because it was the first sermon I ever preached on was Nicodemus at the family service. Low stakes, give it a go, Kim, was on Nicodemus. And I think Nicodemus was a bit like the old Kim. Someone who took the story of being born again pretty literally. What do you mean, Jesus? How am I supposed to go back into my mother's womb as an adult? And Jesus slows him down with one of my favourite techniques, which is a metaphor. Loves a good metaphor, Jesus. And he says, the rebirth won't be from your mother's womb, but it's through baptism, which he doesn't say in that, but it's the baptism from above. That's how we understand it. When we go fast, or when we're compelled by this driver to do or be something we're not necessarily called to do, we miss nuance. We miss grey areas. We miss the intuition that comes to us, that God gives us. When we take time to slow it down and ignore the people in our head who are saying, you got to be busy to be valuable, ignore them. That's not God. Ignore that. Our whole lives change. As I said, I can sit on a beach now and watch trade winds roll in a storm. I've never been able to do that in my life. We can feel less anxious and trust God and surrender to the most terrifying thing in the whole world, which is the unknown. Not knowing can be really, really scary. But God knows, and we can trust God. So all of this is tough. It doesn't matter what age we are. Some of this is really hard to do. But it begins with a decision to say, I am not the sum of what people think of me. It's a really big statement. I am not the sum of what people think of me. I am not the things that my parents expected, or my grandparents, or the things they used to say about being lazy or idle, whatever it is. I am who God says I am. I am Kim, and I am beloved by God, not for what I can do, but for who I am. Now you can say that exact same thing, and I've got it here in my notes. I am, insert your name, and I am beloved by God, not for what I can do, but for who I am. It's a very important message. Friends, this week, this Lent, this lifetime, I pray that you'll take a bit of time just to sit for 5 minutes. Start with 5 and go from there. If you are someone who feels the need to rush or be in a hurry, just be curious. Just wonder about what might be driving that. And then you can start to explore what the 4 km/h God actually says about all of this. Amen.